The system called me a crybaby, so it gave me the villain script. Wiping away my tears, I looked up at my 6'3" brother and stammered, "I'm sorry, but you're a bastard and I have to bully you." The system's voice was harsh in my mind. "Keep insulting him. Slap him, stupid idiot." I tried. I clumsily rose onto my tiptoes, my hand shaking as it reached for his face. The slap was barely a tap. My brother seemed to enjoy it. In the book's world, the man who would one day become the most bloodthirsty and misanthropic regent in history, Cale, was currently kneeling in the snow. Our father had just discovered Cale wasn't his biological son and had cast him out into the freezing cold as punishment. I was his universally despised stepsister, Faye. My role was to deliver him a bowl of scalding chicken soup during his moment of disgrace. Not to drink, of course, to his legs. "Stop crying. All you do is cry. You'll cry all your good fortune away," the system bellowed impatiently in my head. "But I'm scared," I whispered. My legs trembled so badly I could barely hold the bowl steady. It wasn't my fault. Cale was terrifying. He had sharp, fierce eyes and a commanding presence. He'd shot up to 6'3". Even kneeling, he looked like a mountain. Worse, he was a battle-hardened soldier who could snap a man's neck with one hand. He had just rushed back from the training grounds and still wore form-fitting leather armor that did nothing to hide the powerful muscles beneath his chest. The rise and fall of his breathing was the most intimidating part. I hesitated until I got my tears under control. The searing soup had already raised blisters on my hands. I walked over to him. "Brother," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then my hands went limp and the bowl tilted. But Cale, hearing my apology, turned. With a flick of two fingers he batted the bowl aside before it could hit him. Only a few drops splashed onto his thigh. He frowned, his expression darkening as he prepared to question me. Then 2 streams of fresh tears burst from my eyes. The system was yelling again. "Are you an idiot? Why did you say sorry? Are you brain dead? I'm sorry. I've never done anything like this before. Do you want to complete this mission and leave this world or not? I'm warning you, if you keep being such a coward, I'll leave you here to be tortured to death by Cale after he turns evil." "My apologies," I choked, which turned into gulping sobs. Cale's anger melted into exasperation. "Were you holding that for a long time?" he asked suddenly, his gaze falling on the blisters on my palms. I nodded. "Don't play the saint right now," he said coldly. "It's distracting, unsightly, and you've stained my clothes." I froze. In the original story, they scalded Cale's legs so badly that, combined with prolonged kneeling, he became permanently crippled. He was only healed later when the heroine nursed him back to health. Cale never forgot what Faye did. Once he became regent, he had her branded with a hot iron every day. They would let the wounds heal, then tear them open and brand her again. Cruelty and a long memory were Cale's defining traits. A loud mouth and a painful ending were mine. The system shrieked in frustration. "Why does he think you were bringing him soup to drink? Is he crazy? Why is he trying to see the good in you?" "Because I'm timid and soft-hearted," I explained silently, not daring to say it aloud. "Fix this now. Kick him. Kick him a few times. Try to break his leg." I scrambled to obey. I lifted my right foot. Cale, who had just looked away with a cold, dismissive expression, suddenly went rigid. He slowly lowered his gaze. A delicate embroidered slipper was pressed against his lower abdomen, grinding back and forth. The pressure wasn't heavy, it didn't hurt, but the single pearl on the slipper's toe trembled nervously. My voice came out small and nasal as I sniffled, "Are you angry now, host? You call that a kick?" I could breathe on him harder than that. The system roared. I held back my tears, determined not to cry in front of Cale again. The system's scolding left me flustered. I began to pull my foot away, but another sharp reprimand made me press it back. "But I think he is angry. His ears are all red," I whispered defensively. Cale's ears were indeed a translucent crimson, as if all the blood in his body had rushed to them. He stared down at my slipper, then shot me an icy glare. "Faye, do you have any idea what you're doing?" That scared me even more. Ignoring the system's threats, I started sobbing again. "I'm sorry," I whimpered, trying to retract my foot. This time Cale's hand shot out and grabbed my ankle. His palm was searingly hot, His long fingers wrapped around me with ease. Caught off guard, I stumbled and fell in a clumsy heap in the snow right in front of him. The tears I'd been holding back finally came crashing down. Only then did Cale slowly release me. He tilted his chin up, looking down at my pathetic, sprawling form with an air of indifference. "If you ever come near me again, it won't be just a fall." I nodded, trembling, and scrambled away. After a few steps I stopped and turned back. I gave him a deep bow, repeating, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Then I rushed forward again, intending to pat the footprint off his clothes. My hand brushed against a hard, raised object beneath the fabric. He had a dagger hidden there. For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed Cale's face. He seized my wrist, grabbing my collar and pulling me up so we were eye to eye. "Don't get any ideas," he snarled, his voice the kind that came from a man who had seen battle. The force of it made my legs turn to jelly. I stumbled away, my feet sinking into the snow with every panicked step. Once back in my room I finally caught my breath enough to speak to the system. "That counts as a success, right, Mr. System?" I ticked off points on my fingers. I spilled the soup. I kicked him a bunch. He got angry and yelled at me. The system was speechless. "Your next mission," it said, voice dripping with annoyance, "is to imprison Cale. After he's thrown out of the family, you will whip him and humiliate him every day." "How? How do I humiliate him?" "Just improvise." "No, forget it. When the time comes you'll listen to me. Do exactly as I say. Not one word more. Not one action more. Got it?" I nodded obediently, but the system still wasn't satisfied. "Faye, do you understand what do exactly as I say means? If I tell you to breathe hard, you don't get to breathe soft. If I tell you not to cry, you suck those tears right back in." I clenched my fists. "I'll try my best next time. I'm sorry, Mr. System. I messed things up for you this time." That seemed to satisfy it. "By the way, the source text is vague about this part of Cale's life, so you only need to remember one line. You have to get this line right." The system's voice changed into something chillingly cool and flippant. "Cruel and sharp. Brother, for the rest of your life, you are fit for only one thing, to be my dog." When Cale was finally cast out, his body was covered in wounds from being beaten with rods. His thin linen clothes were no match for the biting wind. The only things he took with him were the sword he'd earned through military service and a scented sash his mother had left him. He was a lonely figure, but his back remained ramrod straight. Even in defeat he hadn't lost his formidable spirit. I thought he would have no lingering attachment to our home. But as he stood at the gate he suddenly turned and asked a servant, "Where is Faye?" The servant's face hardened. "Cale, you are no longer part of this family. Why should we report Miss Faye's whereabouts to you?" A flicker passed across Cale's eyes, quickly replaced by a cold sneer. I was just relieved that little pest wasn't here to get in my way. From now on, this family and I go our separate ways. Hiding in a nearby alley, I flinched when I heard that. How did he know I was planning to get in his way? The system snapped. "Stop shaking. He's coming. Grab the club and go. Hit him over the head and drag him into the carriage." I scrambled out of the alley. This time I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I raised the large wooden club. Thwack! Cale collapsed without a sound. Only then did I whisper, "I'm sorry, brother." Thankfully, I'd swept the ground beforehand and even laid down a small mat. It would be rude to let him fall face first into the mud. I hooked my arms under him and dragged him toward the carriage. Cale was thinner than I'd imagined. Up close I could see how his cheekbones jutted out and how his eyes were slightly sunken. He was barely 20, yet he had endured betrayal, punishment, and exile. Through it all, he remained strong, never shedding a single tear. Not like me. Just thinking about what he'd been through made my eyes well up. I admired him. If I had met him in another life, I would have tried my best to be his friend. He was so big I feared losing my grip and letting his head hit the carriage door, so I gently cradled his head against my chest to steady him. Cale was unconscious, and the system didn't care about these small details. After I got him inside, I realized he was burning with fever, his face flushed deep red. "Why do you care?" the system grumbled. "He won't die. You could stab him 7 or 8 times and he'd still be fine. He's the male lead." I hardened my heart, climbed into the driver's seat, and urged the horses toward my private villa. I'd been born to my father's second wife, making Cale and me half-siblings. Now I guessed we were nothing to each other. My mother had come from a wealthy merchant family and left me a country estate for summer retreats. For me it was paradise. For Cale, it was about to become the crucible where he would be reforged in fire. I learned to count time by the pattern of Cale's breathing. At first it was a ragged, febrile rasp under my ear as I sat at his bedside through the long nights. Then, as the fever broke and the swells under his cheekbones softened, his breath became a steady metronome that I could set my own pulse to. I scrubbed bandages until my fingers bled and stitched gauze with hands that shook less every day. When he murmured in some dream, words that might have been poetry or threats, I would freeze and listen, cataloging every syllable. The system hissed like a kettle in my head, not too soft. Not too tender. Remember your line. I could not stop myself from being tender. Perhaps that was what the book wanted, an act of mercy that would be misread, magnified, and then weaponized into legend. Perhaps the system wanted me to fail by doing the one thing the story could not allow, to humanize its villain. Or perhaps, despite its mechanical cruelty, the system's lines could not predict the slow, ridiculous work of two bodies learning to tolerate one another. Cale woke furious. His eyes opened like knives, each blink making me flinch. For a wild second I thought he would drown me in that glare, then his face crumpled as if from a different pain, and he coughed until the room smelled of iron. He reached for my hand before he had the strength to close his fingers. The gesture was small and inconveniently tender. "Why are you here?" he rasped, but the sound was closer to a plea than an accusation. "Because I carried you when you were a child," I said, older words than either of us knew. Honesty landed between us like a stone. He laughed then, a dry bark that made my throat ache. "You would never have done that in the book." "Maybe the book is a liar," I said. The system snarled. "You are reckless," it warned. "Do you want to break the mission?" I ignored it. I had learned, slowly, that there were places even the system could not map, the quiet space where a hand held another hand because neither knew what else to do. The nights we spent waking, telling stories aloud, made up tales of a town that had never been ours, of a dog that once saved a child, were part defiance and part rehearsal for normality. Cale's voice grew less hard. Sometimes he spoke of the training grounds, of nights when he was given a blanket that smelled like the laundress's herbs and felt ashamed to accept it. Once he said, "They taught me to break things neatly. They never taught me what to do when something needed mending." I found myself practicing mending instead. Rumors spread, because rumor always does. Servants who thought themselves clever would whisper that Madame Fay had been seen carrying the outcast back to the villa, that she had tended his blisters, that she had stayed awake with him through the bad dreams. A few expected me to gloat, more expected me to be punished for my complicity. The household was frayed with the tension of outcasts and kin in the same yard. Our father, when he came to see Cale once, looked at him as if measuring the aftermath of a storm. He did not ask why Cale had been spared the worst of humiliation, why a daughter, the one he favored in small mercantile comforts, had seen to his return. Instead he looked at me with a cold arithmetic in his gaze, as if calculating what advantage to extract from my newly demonstrated tenderness. "You are too soft," he said, and there was no rebuke in the voice that older men sometimes used, just the simple accounting of disappointment. "Weakness breeds trouble." "I am not weak," I answered, because something in me had hardened the way salt hardens the taste of water. Cale laughed. "You are both," he said. "Soft and hard, which is the worst kind of danger. But danger, as it turns out, takes a wider route than cruelty. The system, having installed its grievance in our heads like a foreign parasite, did not let go quietly. It kept whispering orders, small at first, then edicts that widened until I felt the edges of my days tattered with directives. Brand him. Make him crawl. Laugh until he begs. Make a spectacle. The ensemble of the original tale, the heroine's path to absolution, the villain's descent into remembered pain, unfurled before us like a trap. I learned to hear the system in two registers, the thin, commanding imperative that could be obeyed, and the bored aside in which it shrugged that everything that came next would be entertaining. One evening, when the sky had the bruised color of stale plums and the driver had not come to the villa because the roads were soaked with rain, the system projected a line with a clarity that felt obscene, cruel and sharp. Brother, for the rest of your life, you are fit for only one thing, to be my dog. It was as though the system had uttered a curse out loud. I could not have mistaken its formal cadences for anything else. In the book that line became the axiom of Cale's identity, his justification for every later atrocity. I was made cruel, therefore I must be cruel. But in that wet evening, when it hung between us like a promise, I did something I had never allowed myself. I told Cale. I wanted to crush the life out of the system with exposure. I pulled him toward the window and said, "There is a voice in my head. It tells me how to be cruel. It wants me to play parts. It says lines." I noticed, absurdly, that my hands smelled faintly of starch. Cale's hand went to his face as if to rub away evidence. For a moment he thought I meant I was mad. Then he looked at me with something like calculation. "So we are both actors," he said. The world tilted. A thought, bright and small, entered my chest. If both of us are puppets, then perhaps we could cut the strings together. Cale's jaw tightened. If there is a hand at the top, cutting one string changes nothing. There are many hands. I did not disbelieve him. But there are hands and there are hands. The system was a kind of hand, cruel, efficient, and grafted to all the moments that pleased it. The others, household, father, later ministers and soldiers, were wretched hands of human making. If we could remove the system's grip, perhaps we could at least choose whose hands would hold us. "Help me," I told Cale. No theatrics. No pleading. Just a small, dangerous request. He held my gaze for a long minute. Finally, "You have always been foolish," he said. "It might be the only valuable thing about you." We did not make a plan so much as an experiment. It began in small, treacherous ways. When the system told me to cut him, I paused. When it ordered me to let the guards tie him and make him fetch water for an entire week on his knees, I kept the bowl for myself and sent the guard away with a curt nod. I invented excuses for his absence. He had had a fever, his foot was tender, and watched for the system's reaction. The voice accused, threatened, promised punishment. It sent images like hunger and fire fluttering across my mind the way a hawk shadows a meadow. When it threatened to leave me to be torn by Cale's future cruelty if I did not obey, I retorted, silently, because open defiance attracted attention, that I was not doing this for myself. I was doing it for us both. Cale's anger at being spared for a tenderness he did not deserve was volatile. He snapped and cursed in the kitchen, breaking plates with gloved hands. He told the men who came to recruit him back to service that he wished to walk a road without spectacles. His cheekbones were carved out of hard stone. Tenderness felt to him like a foreign language that branded him as weak. But he listened. Sometimes he tested me, ordered me to do the sickening things the system wanted, and when I refused, he watched with a disquieted wonder. "I can't tell if you are brave or a coward," he said once in the early months. "Both look the same in the dark." "There is no map for it," I replied. "Only willingness." Somewhere in the slow weather of those months, rumor hardened into a story the servants could not swallow quietly. People began to say that the outcast would return to the town as a parable, rescued by the one who had once scalded him. That tale, simple and monstrous, was not entirely untrue. I had scalded him accidentally, and later, in a touch I could not explain, I washed the scar with gentleness until it softened. But stories loved the neatness of cruelty rebounding. They had no appetite for the more complicated underside, two survivors learning to live under one roof. The system hummed with pleasure whenever the household gossiped. It fed off neat arcs. The court came for Cale eventually, not the pitying prince the heroine would later nurse but men in dull coats with new plans folded in their eyes. He had, after all, a record of military skill that could be useful, and in the breadth of politics usefulness is a commodity that matters more than cruelty or love. The men wanted the sword he had earned, the lineage he could claim, and the spectacle of retribution as a showpiece. Our father wanted a son to show off in cases of trade and negotiation. He wanted someone with the look of suffering to justify his own hardness, the way certain merchants used broken things as proof of their thrift. Cale departed then, not as an exile but as a calculated pawn. He left with little more than the sword and his scented sash, and he did not look back. I watched him go, my throat a tight fist. The system clucked approval. "You have done well. You have fulfilled the arcs that make a story satisfy its audience." People expected me to swell with triumph. Instead I felt curiously bereft. My hands still smelled faintly of starch and medicinal herbs. The rooms where Kale had lingered shivered with absence like a house after a meal. I thought then that perhaps the system was not only cruel, it was lonely in how it sought stories. It arranged people into poses and counted the applause. I wanted to leave that theater, but there was no exit sign for characters. Years moved like chapters. Kale's return was the sort of event that courts made into plays. He came back not ruined but sharpened, with a carriage that rattled like winter bones and men who did not smile when he passed. He had the look of a man who had traded his softness for a blade that always found the throat. People remarked on it as if it were inevitable. The system, predictably, crowed, "You see? The line worked. He is cruel. He will rule. He will remember." What none of the court noticed, or very few chose to see, were the small, unadvertised habits Kale kept. He did not brand me, though he spoke in public of justice and of strict orders. He did not take the sort of pleasure in others' pain that the legend promised. He kept his sword in the same place and ran his fingers along its hilt when he thought no one watched. Once, when a young soldier arrived at the villa and spoke of a flogging he had endured, Kale sat very still and listened, a look on his face that made the soldier's throat close. He told the man to be quiet afterward, roughly, as if frightened of feeling anything more. I had imagined revenge would be a neat, hot thing, like a coal you could hold and then fling away. Instead it was a coiled, dangerous quiet in the eyes of the men who had gained power and a wearying, patient reconstruction of cruelty into law. Ministers counted the cost of mercy and found it wanting. The system liked the ledger. My own place in the story shifted like a shadow moving in a room. I was no longer simply the stepsister who dropped a bowl. People sought my counsel in small things, how to manage the pantry, whether to keep a guest longer in the wet season, and there was power in that kind of steady attention. It was not dramatic. It did not make for songs. But it steadied the house. My hands, trained now in the quiet ministrations of tending, could coax a failing hearth back to life. We existed together within those constraints, Kale and I, because we both had learned that there are degrees within a life. But the system did not forget the neatness it craved. It sent smaller voices now, whispering to others, a contagious hint that revenge must be theatrical. One morning, a council convened to discuss the hastening of justice. Another evening brought a festival whose dances edged out the poor from the town's commons. The system fed on spectacle. Then the decree came that would, in the annals of the future, be called the Day of Tightening, a proclamation that granted the regent, Kale, sweeping powers to root out disorder. They called it order. We called it chains. I watched the signing from behind a cedar column, fingers clenched until my knuckles ached. The room smelled of ink and hot wax. Kale's hand moved precise and slow, as if making neat strokes on a paper were a way to convince the world that his cruelty had reason. The system rattled in my head like a mockingbird. He is doing what he must. He is fulfilling the prophecy of the line. Do not interfere. Do not interfere. The words were a drumbeat in my ears. I remembered the nights I had spent at his bedside, the way his fingers had curled around mine when his pain was raw. I remembered the time he had broken one of my bowls and then spent 3 hours repairing it with trembling hands as though the action itself could erase the past. I could not tell whether I wanted to love him or to see him suffer for the sake of the story that wanted neatness. Both impulses lived in me like two small animals in a cage, eager to fight. When the first round of arrests came, men who had spoken too loudly against tax increases, women who had sheltered itinerant preachers, Kale's men came to the villa for lists. They asked for names politely, as if politeness could anesthetize cruelty. I handed them papers with an even hand. My voice did not shake. Later, in the privacy of a room that smelled of herbs and boiled iron, I recognized my hand trembling on the edge of the table. Kale confronted me that night. He stood in the doorway in silhouette, the moon laid him out like a sculpture carved from night. "You gave them names," he said. There was no accusation in it, only the flat statement of fact. "You asked for lists," I answered. "You could have refused." "Could you?" I shot back. "When the system tells you men must be broken, will you refuse?" He came forward and studied my face as if reading a map. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't know how to be anything but careful." "What good does your caution do the men you cut?" I said. "They are stitched into laws like sutures. You don't even look at whether they heal." Kale's jaw moved, His eyes shone. For a moment I thought he would strike the table, the way men in stories do to show righteous anger. Instead he sank to the low stool by the hearth. He spoke in a voice that had the tired cadence of someone who had been training for a war he did not want to win. "Do you think this is what I want?" he asked. "Do you think the shape of a sword in my hand is the shape of my soul?" "I think you are afraid," I said. The system chirped, "Clever. Provoke. Watch the drama. Watch them fall." He exhaled, a long, soft thing. "Yes," he admitted. "Afraid and tired. I learned early that order is easier to sell than mercy." "You could leave it," I said. "You could abdicate this myth they expect you to be. You could choose something else. You could." "You would have me make a spectacle of my shame," he interrupted. "To the court that would be proof of my humanity is to them a chance to empty me of power. I would be eaten alive." His fear made sense in a kind of horrid arithmetic. Step down and the men around him would tear him apart. Remain and your soul is listed as a state resource. I thought of the system's line, cruel and sharp. "Brother, for the rest of your life, you are fit for only one thing, to be my dog," and felt the old, furious desire to rip it out of the sky with my bare hands. Then something quieter occurred. I realized the system had always been trying to make us blamable. It wanted a villain with a face we could roast on a spit. It wanted me to be the villain's tormentor, the one whose hands nourished cruelty. If we refused the neatness, if Kale refused the role and I refused to fit the cruel mold, then perhaps the story could not find the satisfying arc it wanted. That gave me power of a small, dangerous sort. "You can set conditions," I said finally. "You can refuse to sign things you do not believe will keep people safe. You can refuse to let the ministers name the guilty without proof. You can insist on trials." He looked at me sharply. "And when the ministers call you timid?" he asked. "When the populace wants revenge for a crime you cannot prove?" "We will find another way to ordain justice," I said. "We will make a ritual of reason that buys time and gives people the appearance of being heard." It was a paltry plan, small as a candle in the dark. But Kale accepted it, or at least tolerated it. The first trial we held was clumsy and slow, the second was better. People came and spoke, and officers took their notes. Not everyone was satisfied. The system muttered like an offended beast, "This is dull. This is not what they came for." And yet time, being what it is, has a way of blunting desire. Spectacle loses heat. When famine came and then receded and the town was spared because trade routes shifted and a baroness took pity, the ministers found less room for theatrical cruelty. They still wanted a villain, they still spun their whispers. But in the gaps between their plotting, a different record was being written, a regent who insisted on trials and counts and the slow scarcity of mercy. They called him cautious. He was called worse things in corners. But his legislation did not tear at households in the indiscriminate way that the system loved. At the center of it, between law and rumor, I tended my herbs and mended things. I kept lists not of people to be punished but of measures to prevent suffering, who needed grain, where the well had cracked, which midwife had last taken ill. When a plague season came, Kale sent men to fetch supplies as if his hands had learned the shape of duty. He would not laugh at it, he would not celebrate, but he did what was necessary. The system found it boring. It searched for a jolt. It offered me lines in the dark, "Brand him now, and I will reward you with acclaim. Make a scene in the square and the people will make songs." I refused, again and again. I learned that refusing is a muscle if you train it, small weight at first, then heavier. Each refusal was its own dangerous defiance. I could feel the system gnawing, trying to find another fissure. It whispered that if I refused now, the future would write me small, an unremarkable caretaker, a woman who had failed to secure a legend. It would say I had lacked the spine for drama. And for the first time in my life, I answered the voice aloud. "Legends are for people who cannot live with the truth," I told it, in the empty kitchen while rain traced thin lines on the windows. "Give me a truth." Silence answered, long and unaccustomed. Kale found me then and sat at the table. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "I thought of running away when I was a child," I said. "But then I realized running away is not a thing, there is always something you run from and something you run to." "What would you run to?" he asked. "A simple catalogue of small mercies," I said. A house that does not make sport of the fleeing and the broken. He smiled, which was rare and crooked. Why not build that house here? He said. We have the means. We tried. In the small acts that are the architecture of safety, passing grain quietly to a neighbor, visiting the infirm without announcing ourselves, sheltering those who fled from petty courts, we built a house that was less a structure than a set of practices. It was not perfect. It had holes and sometimes collapses. Ministers still found ways to be cruel. The system still sent its insolent prompts. But fewer people were dragged into spectacles. The court learned slowly, if you starved a town, you did so at the price of your own goods. If you punished a farmer you needed the next season, the wagon that would carry your taxes would be empty. Years stacked like planks. Cale's hair darkened at the temples. The scar on his jaw softened into a pale line that caught the sun like a promise. He never became the embodiment of the system's prophecy. He never embroidered his cruelty into a legend to be sung. There were times he displeased me, times he wielded his prudence like a cudgel and forgot that there were faces behind the numbers, but overall, the arc of his rule bent in a way the original tale had not allowed. It bent toward something messier, justice by deliberation, mercy by calculation, cruelty only when it was the least harmful option. One winter when frost stitched the edges of the panes and the world seemed brittle, the system spoke one last time with a voice like a child's triumphant whisper, you failed. You have undone the story. You will be rewritten. Narrative rights are owned by the greater structure. We will see who the people sing of in future years. I expected that to mean a punishment of some sort, maybe a public spectacle or a private wound. What it delivered instead was a quiet, a cutting off of the pleasant hum that had accompanied our days. The voice retreated into the background and then one day it was gone. It is strange what absence can be. We noticed it first as a small relief, the way a room feels when the wind stops rattling the shutters. Then we realized, in a slow, careful way, that the compulsion to fit ourselves into someone else's outline had loosened. Cale went to the window and watched a dawn that no longer needed to be dramatic. He turned to me and, in a voice that had only ever said few things that were simple and true, said, "Did we win?" "I don't know," I said. "But we are still here." He laughed, quietly. "We are both stubborn." We were. Perhaps stubbornness is a kind of love. In the later years, when the line about being a dog was said in public by some spiteful deputy who wanted to stir the crowd, Cale stood in the square and did not avenge the insult, he simply spoke of the need for hands to be held accountable by law, not spectacle. The crowd grew tired of the deputy's theatrics. Songs remained stubbornly ambiguous, balladeers kept both versions, the cruel regent and the regent who learned to measure his wrath. People are good at keeping both stories, because the world is not neat. I married a man who loved quiet things, a clerk in the council who wrote minutes and loved pennies for reasons no one understood. He taught me how to fold letters properly and how to make a pie without burning the bottom. We had no children. Some nights he would read to me from a book of arithmetic as if numbers could be tender. People wondered why I had not sought greater power or a richer match. I had already found the one thing I could not purchase or negotiate, a life spent choosing. Cale's final years were not simple. There were betrayals and small cruelties. There was a son he had not known how to love, and a daughter who adored him enough to forgive him for his shortcomings. There were audits and a season when an old minister tried to defame him, accusations about the past that had been stoked into a bonfire. Each time, Cale responded with the strange, careful thing he had learned to do. He answered with steadiness. He had the look of a man who had learned to be a vessel rather than a banner. When he died, as all men do, the town expected fireworks. There were speeches and a great deal of ritual. People who had once called him savage lined the streets out of habit. I stood at the edge of the procession, my hand in my husband's. I thought I would feel victory or relief or a particular kind of sorrow, but instead I felt the long, low music like a bell that had nothing to do with triumph. It was the sound of a life that had learned to resist the tidy cruelty of a tale. After the funeral, a child in the crowd asked, loudly and without pretense, "Was Cale a monster?" I thought of the bowls I had mended, of the nights I had held a fevered head, of the laws that sometimes saved a man and sometimes failed him. I thought of the system and its neat lines. I thought of the way cruelty can be named and sold, and of the small salvations that go unsung. "No," I said, and that was not an answer that fitted any legend. He was complicated. The child frowned and then shrugged, Because children are quick to move on. Stories do not always need clarity, sometimes they simply need to be told again, in a voice that understands the world's messy geography. Years later, when the stonework of my hands trembled and my hair had gone white enough that the sun did not want to claim it as a color, a petitioner arrived at the villa with a scrap of paper and a question. He had been a young soldier once, cruelly punished and later pardoned in one of the hearings Cale had insisted upon. He looked at me with eyes that had been reshaped by hardship and asked, simply, "Did you ever hear the system again?" I smiled, and my hands, those same hands that had carried a soup bowl and later mended hems and wrapped medicinal herbs, trembled. "No," I said. It was quieted by the smallest of rebellions, by the choice not to make cruelty into theater. That is not to say cruelty stopped. It merely stopped being celebrated. He nodded as if that answered the thing he had been carrying. He left the scrap of paper with me, a kernel of a new tale, a list of names who had helped their neighbors during a famine, a list the court would likely never print on a page. I put the paper in a small wooden box with other things, a broken porcelain figurine, a lock of a friend's hair, a note Cale had once shoved into my hand that said, in a scrawl that had not learned tenderness easily, "Beware the comfort of a story that satisfies." Sometimes, at night, when silence thickened and the house breathed, I would think of the system as a thing with a shape like a machine, the kind of mechanism that loves neat lines and predictable arcs. Machines want currency, conflict, spectacle, a brittle ending. Human beings want more complicated things, forgiveness by calculation, reconciliation by slow work, the small daily renunciations that make a life livable without being legible as a legend. I do not know if we truly defeated the system. Perhaps it still whispers in corners where men are bored and desperate for drama. Perhaps in other towns it finds an appetite and grows fat again. But in the small orbit we carved, Cale, the village, myself, it learned to be less certain of its triumphs. At the end, when the house had grown quiet and my husband had passed into the silence that is not yet story, I sat in the garden and pulled something out of the box, a chipped saucer, the edge gilded with time. I thought of the night I had tilted the bowl and the soup had slashed across Cale's leg like a comet. I thought of the way the world keeps offering moments in which we can either perform cruelty or refuse it. I would tell you a moral, if such things held. But morals, like legends, are often tidy in the wrong way. Instead I will tell you what I learned, here at the end of the world's small things, that stories have power, but not absolute power, that lines can be written into us, and yet we can choose to trace different ones, that kindness is not an absence of courage but a peculiar form of it, and that the most faithful rebellion is not the rebellion that makes a crowd applaud, but the rebellion that quietly tends to the cracked things until they can be used again. When I finally set the saucer into the soil and planted thyme over it, because thyme smells like homes and saving and small meals, I felt no victory. I felt a weight lift that had nothing to do with applause. It was a lift of something else, a loose thread pulled free. The house we had built, not in stone but in habits and rules and small mercies, would outlast many songs. The system, if it returned, would have to win over the house's many small, stubborn servants. I think of Cale sometimes, and not as a diagram but as a man who learned, late and stubborn, that being fit for power need not mean being fit for cruelty. If that sounds like a partial exoneration, it is because life is partial and exoneration is rare. It is the best I can give him, and perhaps the most honest thing I can say about the world we made. It is hard, and it is possible to be better.